Howdy, folks. I hope you're having a good day. And today I want to share with you one of the most important topics in biblical interpretation that I found useful. And that is everything in the Bible is typology. The whole Bible is typology. And until we understand this, we're going to quibble about everything under the sun and come to no conclusion. The modern man, the modern atheist, for example, or modern agnostic, would ask questions regarding the morality of God. Why did God, for example, tell Israel to massacre the nations around them? Why did God tell Abraham to sacrifice his only begotten son, who was the promised son, Isaac? Is that moral? Telling God's people to murder their own son, is that moral? Why did God allow or even encourage slavery in Israel? So, to answer these questions, I appreciate the ministry of people like Cliff Connectley and his son, but their interpretation is one of progressive change, a progressive work of God. So leading man from severe immorality to greater morality progressively over the ages. I'm sorry, I disagree with that. Because Israel was supposed to be a nation that represented God's will. In other words, they were given God's commandments right from the start. So how could they have reached the point where they needed years and years to progress from immorality to morality? How did they even reach the point where they did immoral acts and God had to slowly change them and transform their society? It's inconceivable, because the entire society of Israel was built around God's commandments. So I strongly disagree with this progressive model, this model of progression in morality from ancient Israel to the present day. I strongly disagree with that. What I'm trying to propose to you today, once you understand this, you will no longer have any problems understanding any of these difficult passages of the Bible. I highly, strongly suspect you will never again have problems understanding the Bible once you understand this principle of typology. Now, what is typology? It is that a character or a narrative, and the narrative could be a true story. I'm not saying that they're all allegorical. I'm not saying that typology, I'm not equating typology with allegory. No, it could be true history we're talking about. But the reason God allowed or even encouraged such acts was because God, unlike man, who is focused on individual morality. In other words, for example, if you look at Abraham and you say, how could God tell Abraham to sacrifice Isaac when Isaac was his promised son, his only begotten son and his promised son? Tell him to commit murder within the family. So in today's context, that would be highly immoral, don't even talk about unethical, because it's not a social issue, it's a family issue, it's highly immoral. And it's murder. So why would God tell Abraham to break one of the 10 commandments, you shall not murder, right? So the individual man, what we look at, the modern man looks at that situation and applies morality to that individual situation. But I want you to look at every Bible story from now onwards, not as a representation of the individual morality, the application of morality in that individual case, as much as God's interest in creating a type, a symbol of something else. And that something else is usually the leadership of God, the relationship between God and man, and how man responds to God and interacts with God. It's usually one of these. So for example, in the case of Abraham and Isaac, God wants to illustrate total obedience. That's the lesson. It's total obedience. There could be other lessons in it. You might seek the heart of God and God might reveal something to you. But to me, God seems to be revealing to me that it was a lesson in total obedience. Isaac was Abraham's most treasured possession, apart from Sarah. And yet, he was told to sacrifice Isaac, and God was testing to see if he would obey. It was about obedience. So, it's not about individual morality in that case, breaking one of the 10 commandments, committing murder. It's about what that story illustrates. The entire Bible is typology. Once you understand this, you won't be stumped by any Bible story. Believe me, you won't be stumped by any Bible story from now onwards. So in the case of Abraham and Isaac, it wasn't about why the 10 Commandments or morality wasn't applied to God himself. Even the modern man will tell you that was murder, right? God was telling Abraham to murder his son. And such an act would be totally unacceptable in today's society. You would get a life imprisonment, if not capital punishment, if you did that to your son. But in that time, God wasn't so concerned with the morality of the issue as in the typology behind it. He wanted us to understand what it meant to be totally obedient to God. And of course, there's another type there, as you can see, Abraham sacrificing his only begotten son at that time in a manner that God did with Jesus, the only begotten Son of God. So that was a type as well. If you look at God telling Israel to massacre the nations around them, God was not so concerned with the morality of that issue as we would be concerned now. We wouldn't want to go to war and massacre our neighboring countries' citizens. In that time, God wanted to illustrate a greater principle, that we must root out every enemy of God in our lives. Not other people, but elements that represent, that the enemies of God represent, elements of enmity towards God. And the chief ones are sin. If we do not root out, if we do not get rid of these sins in our life, we become enslaved to them. And that brings up the other point about slavery. So many people have brought up, why did God encourage slavery in the Old Testament? Even in the New Testament, there was slavery, right? Paul talked about slavery. But Paul rightly used slavery as a type of enslavement to sin. So you had human masters and you had human slaves. And they were a type, an illustration of what would happen if we became enslaved to our sins. If we became addicted, if we became enslaved to sin, and we didn't walk away from sin by the power of Jesus Christ. what would happen is we would become a slave to sin. You either become a slave to sin or a slave to Christ. So we have to choose for ourselves whom we want to be a slave to. So that was a symbol. It's not about the morality of enslavement or whether we should have had human slaves and human masters. That wasn't the point. So if you talk to a modern atheist, for example, they'll ask why, did you have enslavement at that time? We're not even talking about Egypt enslaving Israel. There was slavery within Israel itself. Even in the New Testament, there was slavery. So that slavery was a symbol of whether we wanted to be bonded to God or whether we wanted to be in bondage to sin. Did we want to be bonded to God, or did we want to be in bondage to sin? That was the whole point of slavery. It's not about the morality or immorality of slavery. It was part of typology, part of a type that represented our relationship with God versus our relationship with sin. So you see, once you understand this, every Bible story is part of typology. So we've covered Abraham and Isaac. We've covered the instruction to massacre, the genocide of the nations around Israel that disobeyed God, were enemies of God, representing sin. And we've talked about slavery. There's one very big type that we haven't talked about, and that is marriage. The institution of marriage in both the Old and New Testament is a very clear type of the relationship between man and God. Who God is in our life, who we are in God's life, and how we should respond to God. You see, that's why I said in an earlier video that you're going to hate me for some things that I'm going to bring up. But the reality is, until we recognize these elements in the Bible stories and in Bible instruction, we won't understand the typology behind them. And if we don't understand the typology behind them, we won't understand the Bible for what it was meant to be read as. So, in the time of Israel, women were as property to men. Of course, men didn't love property. They were to love their wives and provide for their wives. They didn't have to provide for their property, but they had to provide for their wives, protect them, and love them, even in the New Testament. But their wives were as property to them. In other words, they owned their wives. Do you know that this is a type, an illustration of God's relationship with man? God owns man. There is no equality between God and man. God is infinitely greater than human beings. Therefore, a husband and wife in this illustration cannot be equal. The husband is the head of the household, and the wife was to submit to the husband. She was not his equal. Just as man, humanity, is not equal to God, and we are told to submit to God. God is our head. Christ is the head of the church, and the church has to submit to Christ. You can bring me verses from Ephesians that we're to submit to one another, etc., etc., but that is talking about Christians submitting to one another. But within a marriage, within a household, the man is the head of the household, and the wife is called to submit to the husband, not the husband submit to the wife. In the same way, the church's relationship with Christ is such that the church is called to submit to Christ because Christ is the head of the church. Israel was to submit to Yahweh. Yahweh was Israel's king until they asked for a human king, and Yahweh gave them Saul and subsequently David. And then they had many other kings. But Yahweh was supposed to be Israel's king, the head of Israel. So you see, this is all typology. It's not about whether it's fair or not. It's not about, if we come with the perspective of feminism, of modernism, modern society, we say, how is this fair to women, right? How are slave laws fair to slaves? But that's not the issue with God. God is not so concerned with the morality behind non-equal spouses in a marriage, or slaves not having equal rights with their masters. They weren't supposed to have equal rights. A wife is not supposed to have equal rights with the husband, because a wife is representative, symbolic of the church of Israel. And a marriage as a whole is symbolic and illustrative of God's relationship with man, of Yahweh's relationship with Israel, of Christ's relationship with his church. The church is Jesus Christ's bride. Whether or not we include today's modern church as part of the church or not. So, and it's very interesting. Do you know that everything you face in marriage is an illustration of what actually happens between the church and Christ and between Israel and God? You know, every time your wife is not submissive to you as the husband, that's an illustration to how the church treats Jesus. We don't always submit to Jesus. We often choose our own way. Israel often chose her own way, even worshipped idols at some junctures, and God punished them by sending them into slavery. That slavery was illustrative of their enslavement to sin, man's enslavement to sin. You see, all this is symbolic. It's all typology. A woman not submitting to her husband is illustrative of how the church doesn't always submit to Christ, and how Israel often deviated from God's plan and refused to follow Yahweh. Same with a wife. Have you not had a wife who did not trust in the husband? Have you not seen that? Right? Many wives don't trust their husbands. They want to do it their own way. And that's what the church does to Christ too. We don't always trust Jesus. We don't always trust God and his ways. We don't always trust that level of faith, apart from salvation, saving faith. We don't always trust God in the journey. You talk about the enslavement of Israel in Egypt. When they walked out of Egypt, that was breaking free from the enslavement to the Egyptians, but illustrative to our enslavement, walking out of our enslavement to sin. But that also was illustrative to following God, because they were actually walking into the wilderness. It wasn't just a day's walk to the promised land. It would be 2 to 2.5 weeks before they could walk to the promised land. This is what I've been told. Of course, sadly, they wandered around the desert faithlessly, and it took them 40 years before they even could enter the promised land. 40 years when they could have just reached it in 2 to 2.5 weeks. But they had to walk into the wilderness. They had to trust God to provide manna for them. They could have said, we were going to starve to death. We're not going to walk out of Egypt. In fact, when they were in the desert, some of them grumbled and complained that it was better to be in Egypt as a slave. Can you imagine? Isn't that illustrative? It's so interesting because it's very illustrative of how many of us behave today. We say, trust in God. You see, I don't even know what He wants. I don't know whether He's going to provide for me. I just lost my job. I have no income. How am I going to provide for my wife and kids? Isn't it so much better when I used to live my lifestyle in the past? A lifestyle of sin, a lifestyle of immorality, a lifestyle of unethical practices. You walked out of that lifestyle when you became a Christian, and now you're lamenting that you had a better life back then than you have now as a Christian, when everything is uncertain. So the Israelites had to walk out of Egypt. They walked into the desert, into the wilderness. And they didn't know, they just had to trust God. They didn't know when the food was going to come. They had to trust God every morning for manna to rain down from heaven. For 6 days. On the 6th day, they were to collect twice the portion, so that on the 7th day they could rest and honor the Sabbath, observe the Sabbath, honor God, and eat from the manna that they had collected extra from the day before on the 6th day. You see, all this is an illustration of faith. Walking into the wilderness is an illustration of faith. And it's the same in the Christian life, isn't it? When we became a Christian and every day we choose to say, okay, I'm going to walk away from this unethical practice, whether it's sales or it's whatever you're doing, your lifestyle of sin that you've walked out of and away from, you're now walking into a new life. But it's a life based on faith, not just for salvation, but how you're going to live the rest of your life. So, you see this enslavement in Egypt and walking out of Egypt was a demonstration of walking away from sin and walking in faith, walking with faith in God. It's symbolic, it's illustrative of that. It's typology, you see. And it's the same in marriage. So you have wives who are not submissive. You have wives who don't trust their husbands, to walk with the husbands, to walk with the leadership of their husbands. And you have wives who don't obey their husbands. As a feminist, as a modern person, are you going to tell me, where's the fairness in this? Why do wives have to obey their husbands and not husbands obey their wives? So you don't understand the institution of marriage in the Bible at all. It's not about the fairness, it's not about morality here. It's about the typology behind it. Because the church and Israel had to obey God. So wives have to obey their husbands. Simple as that. And wives not obeying their husbands is like the church and Israel not obeying God. And lastly, how about wives who disrespect their husbands by talking bad behind their backs to their friends? They gossip behind their backs, maybe to other women. My husband is useless. I wish I had a husband like yours. Have you not heard that? Imagine that kind of disrespect the church gives to Christ, or Israel gives to Yahweh, when they've been blessed with so much. I'm going to need to plug in as my electricity, my charge is running out. My battery is running low. So I'm going to plug in and continue. So you see, folks, the Bible is typology. Everything in it, whether you're talking about slavery, or you're talking about genocide of the nations around them, around Israel, or you're talking about murder, sacrificing your own son, Abraham sacrificing Isaac, or you're talking about marriage. These are the four most commonly contested moral issues. But I'm telling you, it's not a moral issue in God's heart. That's why I say when we interpret the Bible, we have to ask, what is God's heart in this matter? Is God's heart in the matter about the morality of the act and the issue? Or did he want to create a type, an illustration for us to learn something from? So the entire Bible is full of typology. Yeah, it's just typology, plain typology. We just have to understand all the Bible stories about typology, about God's authority over man, man's total obedience to God, total submission to God, man's faith in God alone and nothing else. Because idolatry is as witchcraft. And by the way, talking about marriage, remember I said you'd hate me for some things? And I pointed out that a woman was the property of her husband. A wife was the property of her husband. Do you know that in biblical times, adultery is not the same as adultery now? And if you understood this, you might hate me for pointing it out, but that's the truth. In biblical times, because of the way marriage was set up by God to represent and illustrate our relationship with Him and His authority over us, just as the church is to submit to Christ and Christ was to be the head of the church. A woman was not only the property of a man, but adultery was the definition of a woman, a married woman, having extramarital sex, and a man having sex with a wife of another man. That's the definition of adultery. You say, isn't that the same? No, it's not, because there are a lot of things that are left out of this equation, which is why in the previous video, I did not want to totally disclose this part of it when we talked about lust after other women. Now you see the point. In other words, if a married woman had sex with another man outside of marriage, she committed adultery. If a man, whether it's single or married, had sex with the wife of another man, that was adultery. But if a man had sex with a single woman, a woman who was not married, that's not adultery, whether he's married or single. Even a married man could have sex with many women and have many wives. That was part of the institution of marriage to illustrate a point. What does it illustrate? You tell me, what does that illustrate, that point that a man could have sex with many women and have many wives? You say God doesn't have many, Christ doesn't have many churches, God didn't have many Israels. So what did it illustrate? Does it not illustrate the omnipotence of God? Of course, a man is not omnipotent, a husband is not omnipotent, but it illustrates his potency, doesn't it? If a man is potent enough to have many wives, many women, and I'm not saying that's recommended, especially in today's society, but I'm sharing with you, just like slavery is not recommended in today's society, and murder is not recognized in today's society, but as part of typology, that was what the institution of marriage was about. So a man who had sex with a single woman was not adultery. Even if he was married, it's not adultery. It's only adultery if a man, single or married, had sex with another man's wife, because that man's wife belonged to the other man. was his property. And your own wife cannot have sex outside of your marriage because she belongs to you. She belonged to you. She was your property as the husband. You've got to understand these marriage laws and how they fall into typology. If you're a feminist, you're going to say, curse you, right? What makes you think that a man has such authority and such privileges, and how is it fair to women? No, a man at that time in the institution of marriage, in the typology of marriage, represented God, who is omnipotent. And the woman represented Israel, and in the New Testament, the church. So the woman was to be totally submissive and obedient to the husband. So you might hate me for this, but I'm pointing out the culture of that time and the typology behind marriage. So we've got more to talk about sex when we discuss the chapter Matthew chapter 5, right? But I had to show you this because once you understand the typology of the Bible, you won't misunderstand the genocide in the Bible. You won't understand the sacrifice of Abraham's son Isaac. At least God told him to, but held his hand. He didn't sacrifice Isaac in the end. And of course, Israel disobeyed in that she did not commit genocide of the nations that God had commanded her to massacre. We've talked about slavery and why slavery was not only allowed by God, but in some circumstances, it looked like God didn't even stop it. Maybe even encouraged it. Because it was a symbol of our bondage to sin. And how God came to redeem us and buy us out of slavery. And from slavery, we had to walk out of slavery willingly. God paid the price for us to be set free from slavery. But if we choose to continue in slavery to sin, we're not walking out of that slavery. We'll still be in bondage to sin. Walking out is a deliberate act of our will to walk out of the enslavement to sin, because Christ has already paid the price for us to walk out of it. He has redeemed us from slavery. And after we walk out, it's a walk of faith. You're going to walk into the wilderness where you'll be tested. That is another episode too, talking about being tested in the wilderness. But as we are tested in the wilderness, we need to walk in faith for God's provision. You see, the Bible is so interesting, but only if you understand that the whole Bible is typology. Otherwise, you're going to misunderstand a lot of these stories. And you're going to have to say, you're going to have to reason that, oh, God was trying to be progressive, gradually changing society. Israel was a society born out of God's commandments. So when did they regress to that stage? In fact, all these things like genocide, all these things were commanded by God. Even slavery in Israel. So I hope you understand that the whole Bible is on typology, is typology, and have an interesting time studying the Bible that way. But most of all, remember the episode of the new way of interpreting the Bible, seeking after God's own heart whenever we read the Bible. Thank you so much for tuning in, and be blessed until the next episode.